Hi there. A while ago, a friend recommended a book called Gang War, and he loaned it to me. And even though true crime isn't really a genre that I pay a lot of attention to, with some reluctance, I started reading it, and I was quickly engrossed. It was the story of gang wars in Manchester, going right back to the 50s through to the Moss side, very violent, all the shootings. Um, Obviously, the rave scene had an impact on it, and right through. Some really violent characters and feuds and so on. And it was a terrific book. I may fast forward a bit, and I was contacted by a publisher with a view to uh, writing what became Working with Warriors. And we sat down and had lunch, and he mentioned that his company specialised in true crime. And I said, well, I haven't really read much true crime. I said, but I did read one really terrific book called Gang War, written by a chap called Peter Walsh, and he was the chap who I was having lunch with. He ran the publishing company as well as writing several of the books. And I'm really glad to say that he's written another book which is called Drug War, which covers the whole rise of the drug trade in the United Kingdom and with its overseas links, obviously, and the efforts by law enforcement to counter it. And the book is three main parts. Part one is the 60s and then into the 70s, where really the start of the rise of cannabis really kicked off to major levels. In the 60s it was dabbling, and the start of hard drug usage. Then into part two, the 80s, heroin and cocaine began to arrive in bulk, and illegal drugs revolutionized the British underworld. Um, Really, people who had previously been into cash in transit robberies and things like that saw that it was a lot easier to make money out of drugs. And then part three, the international trade, the targeting of the UK by major trafficking organisations in Colombia, Holland, Morocco, Pakistan and Turkey. The response was a concerted effort to disrupt supply lines upstream at source. So the book opens with a United Nations conference in 1961, which really tries to get a unified look at the drug trade and the drug problems that may face different governments. Well, they didn't really get much right with that because, you know, we've all seen what happened since. One of the things I never understood, I remember it was about 1982 or so, I was talking to a detective over in Birkenhead, and he said he was being really busy and going after heroin dealers. And I went, what? Heroin? And he said, yeah. I said, I didn't think we had a problem with heroin. He said, you know, it's Smack City over the walls in Birkenhead. So I had been under the impression that it was all under control, because I remember back in the 60s when you could become a registered heroin addict and get heroin on prescription from a doctor, because I was down in London and you would see the addicts at the all-night Boots chemists in Piccadilly waiting after midnight so they could get the next day's prescription. and then they'd go into the underground station at Piccadilly, and they would inject in the toilets there. And so that we didn't have a problem with heroin. And this detective said, oh no, he said they did away with that. And it must have been the most near-sighted policy ever, because the result has been this massive increase in the drugs trade. Anyway, the book, which is a forensic analysis of the problem and of the potential solution, goes really deeply into the efforts, particularly of Her Majesty's Customs, who, right from the start with their investigations branch, which became Investigations Division, and then it became the National Investigations Service. And many of the characters, professionals from those times, were interviewed for the book. People like Sam Charles and Brian Clark, who were major figures. The book does detail a lot of the violence that came into it, the shootings, the rivalry, the disputes over territory and so on, because these were very violent people. As I say, a lot of them were former armed robbers, and also the overseas people from the cartels were specialized in violence to intimidate people. And the response by the customs and also by the police were facing really dangerous people, and both organizations started in a rather rudimentary way, very little in the way of training in things like surveillance and so on, but then developed highly professional and sophisticated human and technical surveillance capabilities. The book mentioned the black box covert capability, which is really interesting. Hand in glove, because of the amount of money involved, there's corruption. And Peter Walsh pulls no punches in naming names and pointing the finger at corruption in the police and unfortunately also in the customs. It's just part of the territory, really. Really, the efforts to control drugs have really been a failure. I think everyone must admit that. Drugs have permeated society at all levels ever since the 60s, to the point where politicians now openly admit, at one time they would admit that they smoked cannabis, and now they will admit they've taken cocaine. So that's the level of the problem. I remember a court case where the police were objecting to the license of a venue because they'd raided it and found people with drugs. And the barrister for the venue quizzed the inspector, the police inspector, and he said, well, you found these people with drugs, where did they come from? So he said, what do you mean? He said, well, they came from outside, they came from the street before they were in the venue, would that be correct? So he said, yeah, obviously. So he said, well, whose job is it to control drugs on the street and in the country widely? It's your job, it's the police's job. You can't control drugs in the country, how do you expect the venue to control drugs in their space? And actually, they retain the license. So it's fairly insoluble problem, but it's nevertheless makes a fascinating book, and I think it should be much more widely read. There's a whole literature on the drugs, the war on drugs out there, but I would say this is the best book I've come across on the subject, and I highly recommend it.